Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange career of the necessary woman. What she did in ancient Rome and more. And no, it's not cute. It's weird, it's wild, and you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes without crying or getting fined in barley. Picture yourself in ancient Rome. Your sandals stick to goat pee-covered cobblestones, your toga's riding up in the worst possible way, and you're desperately trying to avoid eye contact with a senator who's way too into his wine. You can smell the sweat of gladiators who've just returned from a fight, and maybe, just maybe, there's a faint whiff of roasted goat. The last thing you want is to get caught in the crossfire of Roman society's necessary women. Why? Because these ladies? Yeah, they were crucial to Rome's survival, yet they were mainly ignored by history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's start with the concept of the necessary woman in Rome. And I swear, you're about to wonder if they were required or if someone in the history books just liked the sound of it. These women weren't saving empires or making history. No, they were the background noise, the unsung heroes of domestic chaos, gladiatorial contests, and political puppetry. In a world where your daily grind probably included dodging chariot traffic and surviving the worst hygiene rituals of the century, necessary women were those you'd least expect actually to have power. Take midwives, for example. Oh yes, while you're busy wondering whether or not to eat that questionable fish from the market, Roman women are out there, birthing babies and delivering new generations of chaos. Midwives in Rome were trusted to bring life into this world in the most unglamorous way possible. The least glamorous of the least glamorous jobs, we're talking like the kind of job where backup isn't an option. But hold up, did they get any credit? No. Midwives were crucial to Rome's survival, but the only time they were mentioned in history was when something went wrong, and that's when you get the scandalous stories. Historians still argue whether midwives were underappreciated or unnecessarily overworked. But let's be real, they didn't get any shiny medals or even a thank you card for saving future emperors. Instead, they probably just got sticky baby goo in their hair. You, on the other hand, would have been clutching onto your sandals for dear life as you tried to escape the smell of, well, everything. And that was just the tip of the iceberg for these necessary women. They were at the very heart of the empire's survival, but no one cared enough to give them the respect they deserved. I mean, does this sound familiar? Because it's basically the same situation where your essential coworkers are always running the show while the important people take all the credit. But in this case, it was more like running an empire while you were completely ignored. Now, these women were necessary in a very specific sense. No, they weren't running around in political circles, wielding power in the usual way. They weren't sitting at the emperor's side giving speeches. No. That would have been too easy. Instead, these women were tasked with performing the nitty-gritty work. Stuff that society couldn't function without. Sure, they might have run entire households, birthed the next generation, and dealt with the worst aspects of Roman life. But for every one of them who made life a little less disastrous, there were 5 more women just trying not to get stuck in a messy toga situation at an awkward social event. Honestly, it's kind of like being stuck in the role of superhero when the cape keeps falling off and the world is completely oblivious. It's a thankless job, but it pays in survival, at least for the empire. Let's get real about childbirth for a second. When you're dealing with the squeamish reality of Roman pregnancy, birthing a child in that ancient era wasn't just about pushing out a baby, it was a damn spectacle. Midwives were the ones left holding it all together while everyone else prayed that the whole thing didn't end in disaster. The smell alone could probably knock a person unconscious, but midwives? They were there doing the work no one else could stomach. And if it went wrong, guess what? The midwife would be the first person blamed. Women didn't get an easy out in this era, especially when it came to something as visceral as childbirth. And don't even get me started on the delivery room, which wasn't really a room at all but more of a chaotic mess with people shouting instructions no one cared to follow. But of course, Rome being Rome, midwives were necessary. They just weren't recognized. It's like the unsung heroes who are ignored by history yet hold everything together. Think about the invisible moms who raise you. No one cares about their work until they mess it up. Same thing, just with more blood and sweat. Historians might say, Oh, they were essential. But there's no one waving a flag for them. At best, they get a side note in a scroll no one ever reads. Now, there's an argument to be made about the idea of women's work in Rome. You know, how the necessary women were relegated to household duties and childbearing, and how that was all they did. But again, we're talking about women who kept the empire afloat, without credit or rewards. Oh, and let's not forget the gladiatorial wives, the women who had to sit there and watch their husbands or brothers get butchered in the arena. Were they just supposed to nod and applaud? No, these were strong women, and yet no one ever acknowledged their pain, except for the odd poem by a brooding poet. Nice, right? Imagine the fury these women must have felt. But they kept the act together. They had to. The empire was necessary, and if they didn't do their bit, it could all crumble. And while we're all looking at Roman soldiers or emperors, these necessary women were behind the scenes, keeping it all in line, and keeping their sanity just barely. So, here's the catch. These women might have been labeled necessary, but their roles were as confusing as that one aunt who shows up at family events in a completely weird outfit and still gets no attention. Like, yeah, she's essential, but the world would rather ignore her and focus on someone less interesting. No, they weren't the ones riding chariots into battle, but without them, the very foundation of Roman society might have buckled. These women weren't just essential. They were the glue holding it all together in the most ridiculous, unsung way possible. And when it came to survival, they were the ones who made sure things kept running. Not that anyone bothered to remember them. Welcome back, my fellow time travelers. Grab your helmets and hold onto those tunics, because we're about to dive deep into the Rome that never sleeps, where the women were necessary, for reasons that make zero sense, but definitely not useful in the way you might think. Imagine this. A Roman woman, somewhere between pouring wine for the men and cleaning up the leftovers from a 12-course banquet. Does she hold power? Does she call the shots? Absolutely not. But she's necessary. Like the weird cousin who shows up at every family reunion to make things awkward. You know those Roman baths? The ones where dudes would strip down and act like they weren't just wallowing in communal filth? Yeah, so Roman women, necessary women, were there too. They didn't exactly get to enjoy the luxury of these bathhouses. Oh no. They had their own section, and trust me, it wasn't relaxing. While the men flung around oils and shouted about politics, these women were busy being necessary in their own sticky, sweat-drenched ways. One historian suggested that women weren't just bathing. They were probably cleaning up the mess left by their male counterparts. Like, imagine being the one tasked with scrubbing grease from Emperor Augustus's sweaty back after he's been discussing military tactics in a pool of grime. Yeah. No thanks. Historians still argue whether the whole bathhouse setup was a gendered space, or just part of Rome's way of separating the genders while pretending to be totally equal. But let's face it, women didn't get to relax or gossip about their dreams like we do today. In fact, most of their existence was just a weird mix of doing everything while being actively ignored. Here's the kicker: women were absolutely needed for all the basic grunt work of society. They cooked, they cleaned, they birthed the future generation of warriors, philosophers, and emperors, whether the world wanted them to or not. Were they respected for these efforts? Oh hell no. Women didn't even get credit for the significant role they played in the family's social status. Let's break it down. A Roman man? He's living his best life, attending banquets, rubbing elbows with senators, and making speeches about war. Meanwhile, his wife? Oh, she's the one running the household, managing the finances, and making sure little Marcus grows up with enough decorum to someday pretend he knows how to lead. You think this woman gets a thank you card? Nope. She's just necessary, like the invisible hand in every well-functioning Roman society. Imagine this setup. You're a Roman woman minding your business, raising future emperors and politicians. You're doing all the hard stuff, managing the household, keeping things running, making sure everything doesn't descend into chaos. And then your husband strolls home with a proud grin on his face, wearing that stupid toga he's way too excited about. He's been at the Senate all day making decisions while you've been doing the real work. And what does he say? Oh, good job, honey. The house looks nice. Now let's eat. Does he even realize that he would probably be eating off your hard work and managing the household while you cleaned up after his messy toga? Not likely. Historians still argue whether Roman women, especially the necessary ones, were marginalized or stuck in this absurd cycle of never being fully recognized for their contributions. But here's the truth. They were essential in the most ironic way possible. They were expected to do everything without getting the respect or power that came with it. Women were essentially unpaid consultants to the Roman Empire. Can you imagine the horror? Being the one who knows what's going on, who keeps everything running, yet never getting credit for any of it? This idea of being necessary but not useful goes deeper than just domestic duties. It stretches into political and social power. Sure, women were necessary in terms of childbearing, the empire had to grow somehow. But did they ever get a say in the direction of the empire? Of course not. They had to rely on their husbands or fathers to make decisions. The whole structure was as rigid as it gets. If you were a Roman woman, you didn't have the option to have it all. You had the choice to support your husband, raise the next generation, and make sure everything around you didn't fall apart. You were necessary. But that was basically just a nicer way of saying, you're going to do a lot of hard work, and no one will care. And let's not even talk about the pressure on women's appearances. Romans were obsessed with beauty. It wasn't enough for women to exist, they had to look the part. Like, imagine having to get dolled up for a public bath, while your Roman husband is out getting complimentary wine and talking about military strategy. Women had to constantly stay fresh, thanks to Roman cosmetics, or risk being considered less valuable in society's eyes. And trust me, these beauty treatments were insane. Women in Rome were out here using lead-based makeup and attempting to look youthful with things that could give you cancer today. They needed to stay pretty, or else they'd risk being ignored altogether. And all this to maintain their necessary place in society? Historians still argue whether beauty standards in Rome were as toxic as modern-day ones. But the truth is, it was a battle for your very value. If you couldn't maintain your appearance, your value as a necessary woman would be drastically diminished. The same woman who kept Rome going was also the one spending hours each week trying to look young and vibrant. She wasn't even allowed the luxury of looking tired. She had to constantly be on her toes, juggling 100 different tasks. And, oh yeah, look stunning while doing it. No biggie. And where does all this leave us? Well, if you're a Roman woman, you can either scream into the void or keep going because, really, what else can you do? Your fate is already sealed, and your work is just part of the system. You're necessary, sure, but no one's going to throw you a parade for it. In fact, you're probably just going to get passed over for another non-essential Roman man who gets to make speeches while you're out there cleaning the mess. But don't worry, your work is essential. Just no one's going to admit it. Sound familiar? Yeah. Some things never change. Alright, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the unsung heroes of ancient Rome, the midwives. No, not the ladies with perfect skin who'd casually wander around the spa, but the hard-hitting, real deal that had the actual power of life and death. No pressure. Right? Let's take a trip into the birthing rooms of ancient Rome, a place where discomfort, blood, and Greek medical advice all collided to create what can only be described as a medieval nightmare that somehow still ended up with babies being born. And guess who had to do all the dirty work? You guessed it, women. Because in Rome, if you were the one helping others enter the world, there's a good chance you were stuck in the trenches, far away from any credit or glory. Imagine playing a role as significant as saving humanity, but still getting treated like a glorified assistant. It's almost poetic, right? You're literally helping create the empire's future, while everyone else gets credit for existing. You, as the midwife, would have been there in a nasty birthing room, probably knee-deep in some of the grossest conditions known to man. No clean sheets, no sterile environment, just you, the woman in charge, who hopefully knew what she was doing, and a room that smelled like death and baby vomit. Birth wasn't romantic back then. It was chaotic, gross, and, more often than not, very, very messy. The ancient birthing room was a place where you could watch a family's future crumble or thrive in a matter of minutes. But guess who gets zero recognition for making it happen? Yep, that's right, midwives. And if you think these women had it easy, think again. Imagine trying to deliver a baby with no modern medicine, no epidurals, and no clean towels. No, in Rome, midwives were expected to provide children in the most basic, gritty conditions, sometimes without even basic hygiene. It's honestly the kind of nightmare scenario that makes you want to hug your heavily sanitized hospital room and never complain again. At least today, they're handing out goodie bags after a baby's born. In ancient Rome, you were lucky if you made it out alive, let alone with any recognition for your work. Historians still argue about how much power midwives actually had in ancient Rome. Were they just assistants to male doctors? Or were they true experts who understood the human body better than some toga-wearing dude who'd never delivered a baby in his life? The truth? It's kind of a gray area, like whether or not a pizza should have pineapple. But one thing is clear, midwives were the unsung, gritty backbone of the birthing process. They knew the human body like no one else, and yet they were constantly overlooked by the men in the field. Let that sink in. These women knew more about life and death than the people with all the power, and yet their wisdom went largely unrecognized. No awards, no praise, just lots of messy sheets and a big fat thanks that never came. Midwives had a direct hand in the survival of future generations, but they got absolutely zero acknowledgement. The thing is, they weren't just delivering babies, they were also counseling women through the whole ordeal. Can you imagine being a woman in labor and hearing some ancient doctor say, this should be fine, while the midwife is the one actually holding things together? Imagine that extra layer of stress while you're going through something that should definitely be getting more attention than the guy with the toga. Let's face it, Rome was all about the show, and the midwives were behind the scenes, pulling the strings that kept the future of Rome intact. But of course, midwives were about as appreciated as the person who fixes the Wi-Fi at your office. No one notices until something goes wrong. You know, it's like that unsung role in a sitcom. Everyone's living their best lives, and then someone drops a massive bomb, and suddenly the person who was always there in the background is finally appreciated. But unfortunately, ancient Rome didn't work like that. You didn't get the thank you speech. You just kept the empire running with your skill, expertise, and the reality of no one caring. Let's talk about what midwives had to go through when they weren't dealing with the mess of childbirth itself. Picture this. The poor midwife had to contend with all kinds of medical advice from everyone around her, even though she was likely more qualified than the so-called doctors who couldn't even spell birth canal. And let's not forget that midwives were expected to not only deliver babies but also treat the mothers with some basic post-delivery care, which usually meant rubbing some oils on them and sending them off to rest, while hoping that the baby didn't develop some horrible ancient Roman disease. Good times. Historians still argue over the specifics of midwifery practices in ancient times, but what's consistent is the fact that these women were integral to Rome's growth. The birth rate wasn't exactly skyrocketing, and yet these women were there, ensuring that new generations came into the world, despite the most primitive methods. These women were like the silent backbone of the Roman family, pulling the strings of the future and getting zero credit for it. They were literally making sure Rome didn't collapse by delivering the next generation of conquerors, while society just shrugged and moved on to the next military conquest. It's like someone holding the elevator for you while you're too busy scrolling through Instagram to notice. And let's talk about the irony. These midwives were necessary for Roman survival, and yet they were barely acknowledged. Imagine being the one person who has to fix everything and never even getting a pat on the back. It's honestly the story of every invisible hero throughout history, and it's a damn tragedy. But hey, that was the job of women in Rome. Be essential, be hardworking, and expect nothing in return. You were necessary, but only as a footnote in the annals of history. The only reward you'd get is a modest meal and the knowledge that you helped build an empire without even the luxury of recognition. Alright, let's get honest about something that probably makes most of us cringe. Ancient Roman prostitution. You thought it was just a side hustle for a few desperate souls, right? Well, buckle up, because the truth is much darker, deeper, and weirder than a Roman Times commercial would have you believe. Roman society didn't just tolerate prostitution, it thrived on it. And women, well, they weren't just working the streets. They were holding up the entire economic and social fabric of Rome, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. Spoiler, nobody wanted to accept it. Imagine you're a Roman woman, Let's say you're not from a noble family, and you're trying to survive in a city full of sweaty, toga-wearing men who really like their wine and their company. Maybe you don't have the luxury of a respectable job, whatever that was in the first century. So what do? The answer's obvious. You become a prostitute. It's not glamorous, it's not fair, but it's how so many women in ancient Rome got by. The thing is, prostitution was actually integral to Roman life in a way we don't really talk about today. Yeah, these women were essential, asterisk not asterisk, because they were leading political revolutions or raising children to become emperors. Still, because they were giving the Roman men exactly what they wanted, and let's face it, in a hyper-macho society like Rome, that meant everything. Historians still argue over how exactly prostitution influenced Roman society. Some suggest that it was a tool of social control, while others claim it was just a way for the elite to keep their dirty little secrets under wraps. But what's irrefutable? Prostitution was a central, necessary part of Roman urban life. It wasn't just about pleasure or relief. It was about managing power dynamics, controlling male desires, and making sure those in charge didn't lose their minds from all the stress of ruling an empire. Now, don't get all naive and think this was some empowered choice these women had. Let's be clear. Most of them didn't do this because they had dreams of becoming entrepreneurs. Many of them were enslaved people, or at the very least, living on the edge of poverty. Rome was a hard place for women with zero options, and prostitution wasn't really choosing a career. It was survival. But in a way, they were the invisible force that kept everything running smoothly. Without these women, the men who ran Rome would have been left in chaos, mentally and physically. Imagine having to deal with all the stress of running an empire while constantly being surrounded by people who expect you to be the very symbol of strength. You'd probably need a few escapes here and there, and Roman men had theirs. Now, the whole necessity thing comes into play in a big way. You didn't think Roman society would function without these women, did you? These women, serving as both entertainment and stress relief, were just as crucial as any senator giving speeches. We like to think of Rome as a place of noble warriors and epic battles, but the real engines of Roman daily life were often just a couple of lonely, forgotten women in the shadows, making sure that the men who actually ran things had their moment of reprieve. Historians still argue whether prostitution in Rome was empowering or just a reflection of society's abuse of women. And honestly, the answer's probably a little of both. On one hand, these women were able to generate wealth in a society where women had little access to money. They may not have been respected, but they certainly had a unique form of leverage. On the other hand, most of these women were treated like dirt. They were often stigmatized, seen as dirty or impure. And the very men who benefited from their services would turn around and scorn them. If you were a high-ranking Roman man, it was perfectly acceptable to pay for sex, but God forbid anyone find out about it. In fact, public morality in Rome was so tied up in hypocrisy that most Roman men would never admit to their need for private entertainment while maintaining a front of noble virtue. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Some of these women actually had more power than you might think. In ancient Roman culture, there was a particular class of high-end prostitutes called **meretresses***. They were the ones who could demand higher rates and were often associated with luxury. Imagine being one of these women who could navigate both the physical and social demands of the job. Managing men's desires, yes, but also playing the political game to your advantage. Think of them as the original girl bosses, but in an extremely unfortunate line of work. They weren't just doing it for the cash, no, they were weaving a web of influence and power that most Roman men had no idea about. These women knew how to manipulate their position in society to get the most out of it. Historians still argue over the moral implications of prostitution in ancient Rome. Was it a sign of Rome's decadence? Or was it just a necessary evil for the empire to function? Either way, there's no denying that it existed as a deeply entrenched part of the society's culture, and the women involved were, whether they liked it or not, pivotal to the Roman social and political fabric. Without these women, the empire's very stability may have been compromised. Sure, they weren't getting plaques for their work, but these women kept things running in a city where men's egos and desires were as explosive as their military campaigns. Now, imagine being one of these women. existing in a society where you were essential to the well-being of the empire but also disrespected at every turn. No one was giving out medals for your service, and any recognition was either grudging or whispered in hushed tones. Yet, without you, the very men who had power over life and death would have lost their grip on the empire. The paradox is deliciously absurd. These women were as much a part of Rome's success as any gladiator or senator, but they were also invisible, relegated to the margins of history. They were necessary, but as with most things in ancient Rome, their value was only recognized when it was too late. It's like being the unsung hero in a horror movie. Your contributions save the day. Still, no one even bothers to acknowledge you until the credits roll and everyone's already gone home. Except in this case, no one will ever mention you. Ever. Alright, buckle in because we're about to get holy, but not in the way you're probably expecting. Ancient Rome wasn't just a city of debauched parties, gladiator fights, and conspicuous consumption. Oh no, it was also a city of religion, and religion in Rome was more of a business than a spiritual experience. And guess who was right at the center of this religious circus? That's right, women. Necessary women, to be specific. They weren't exactly out there preaching or leading crusades, but they played a pivotal and bizarre role in Rome's religious rituals. And, as with everything else, their role was always crucial yet never exceptionally respected. But hey, at least it gave them some interesting power, even if it didn't come with a nice paycheck or an Instagram account to boast about it. Let's start with the Vestal Virgins. Yes, virgins, but not in the way you probably think. These women weren't leading cults of their own. No, they were volunteering or forced into one of the most high-stakes, pressure-filled jobs in Roman society. The Vestal Virgins were responsible for maintaining the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta, which, no big deal, was basically the pulse of Rome itself. If the fire went out, well, bad things were going to happen, like empire-crumbling bad things. Imagine living under the constant threat of, if I mess this up, Rome dies. Sounds like a vacation to me, right? Historians still argue whether these women were empowered or merely pawns in a high-stakes religious game. Were they respected for the sacredness of their role, or were they just tools in a broader patriarchal system? Some scholars argue that being a Vestal Virgin was the ultimate honor for a woman in ancient Rome. After all, these women were entrusted with an incredibly sacred duty. Keeping the flame of the empire alive. Literally. But here's the kicker. No matter how much power they held, no matter how crucial they were to the well-being of the state, they were still subjected to the whims of male priests, politicians, and the public. They had to live under strict rules, like really strict, and were forever stuck between religious reverence and patriarchy's watchful eye. Imagine this. You're a young girl, probably around 6 or 7 years old, chosen by the state to become a Vestal Virgin. You're dragged away from your family, locked into a life of chastity, ritual service, and the unyielding weight of do not let the sacred flame go out. And if you mess up, you're buried alive. No joke. This was the punishment for failing. So yeah, a little pressure. But despite all that, the Vestal Virgins held a special place in society. They had privileges other women didn't, like owning property, attending political events, and even having a say in some public matters. But, their daily life was basically an endless cycle of rituals, like a never-ending episode of keeping up with the gods. Their power was paradoxical. They were simultaneously needed, but their freedom was constantly restricted by the rigid expectations of Roman religious life. All of this so the empire could keep running. While the Vestals were essentially the spiritual superstars of Rome, albeit bound by rules more extreme than a high school dress code, they weren't the only women involved in Roman religion. There were also priestesses, women who were responsible for overseeing ceremonies and rituals, guiding public worship, and interpreting the will of the gods. But, and this is important, these women didn't always have control over the religious practices themselves. Most of the actual religious power was held by men, because, of course, men were seen as the more rational beings in a city where ritual and superstition were literally part of everyday life. Women were involved, but they were expected to stay in their lanes. Their role in religion wasn't about leading but about supporting. Let's talk about one bizarre intersection: the role of the sacred prostitute. Yes, this was a thing. As weird and uncomfortable as it sounds, some Roman religious practices involved holy prostitution as part of the worship of specific deities, like the goddess Fortuna. And while you're sitting there trying to process this uncomfortable truth, understand this: these women were seen as divine in their own right. Their sexual acts were viewed as a form of worship, a way to channel divine energy into the world. Women didn't have to be just wives and mothers. They could also be part of rituals designed to ensure prosperity or the fertility of the land. And before you start saying no thanks, let me remind you that these women were, in some ways, held up as being powerful in the eyes of the gods. Did that translate to absolute power in the Roman political system? Absolutely not. But it did give them a seat at the religious table, which, in a male-dominated society, was no small feat. Historians still argue about the exact role of sacred prostitution in Roman society. Was it a common practice or just a rare, obscure tradition practiced in specific temples? Was it empowering or exploitative? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Some women probably saw it as a way to gain influence or security, while others were forced into it, seeing it as the only way to survive. Either way, it's a weird, fascinating, and entirely messed up piece of Roman religious life that proves just how deeply entangled women were in the rituals of the empire, even if those rituals were pretty twisted. And then, of course, there's the mystery of the female gods in Roman religion. There weren't a ton of powerful female deities in the Roman pantheon. Let's be real, gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Neptune were the real stars of the show. Still, there were a few goddesses who had significant influence. Goddesses like Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, and Diana, the goddess of the hunt. These women were not just the backup singers to the male gods. They were, in their own way, necessary to the survival of Roman society. Without Ceres, there would be no crops. Without Diana, the hunt and the survival of warriors would falter. These deities were deeply entwined with the everyday lives of Romans, and their worship was often carried out by women who believed that by performing certain rituals, they were securing Rome's future, even if that future didn't seem to care much about them. So what's the bottom line here? While women in ancient Rome may not have had the same rights or privileges as their male counterparts, their role in religion was absolutely crucial to the machinery of Roman society. Their power was not in leading religious movements or commanding armies, but in subtly influencing the course of Roman life through sacred rituals, temples, and the subtle art of divine appeasement. They were necessary but always on the fringe, powerful but never quite at the center. Women may not have been publicly acknowledged as the religious leaders of Rome, but they were absolutely vital to its religious fabric. Without them, the fires of Roman prosperity would have gone out a long time ago. Get ready, because we're diving into a world of paradoxes, where Roman women were technically in control of their households, yet had zero power in public life. Welcome to the world of the domina, a title that sounds a lot fancier than it actually was. Domina translates to mistress or lady of the house, and while it suggests a certain level of prestige, let's not kid ourselves. She didn't have the type of power you'd expect if you were a modern woman running the show. No. Being a domina was like being the manager of a company where you do all the work, but the CEO gets the credit. And by CEO, I mean your husband, who's out there eating grapes and telling jokes to his buddies while you manage the chaos he's created. Welcome to the invisible power of women in Roman households, where control was the name of the game, but only in the domestic, non-public sense. Imagine it, you're a Roman woman, and you're in charge of everything that happens inside your home. You're the one making sure the household enslaved people don't steal the wine, the kids are learning their Latin, and the kitchen has enough bread to survive another week. You manage the household finances, you make sure the social calendar is organized, and you deal with all the domestic chaos that's constantly threatening to unravel the whole operation. But the kicker? Your husband, the actual head of the family, comes home after a long day of doing whatever it is that men do in the Senate and expects to be treated like the hero of the household. You're the domina in charge, but you're not even allowed to have your own name on the family's business cards. In this scenario, you're probably living in a constant state of, I could run this empire better than him, but I guess I'll just do all the hard work. Historians still argue over whether the Roman domina wielded true power or whether her control was merely a social illusion. Sure, she could dictate everything that happened within the confines of her home, but when it came to public life, Well, she was as irrelevant as a toad in a toga. Her husband could lend her control over the family's assets, but they never actually belonged to her. Sure, you could say that the domina ran the household, but only in the sense that invisible pillars hold up the empire's foundation. No one ever notices the support until it crumbles. Let's break this down. It's truly absurd. The domina could have complete control over a household, dictating who entered, who left, and how day-to-day activities unfolded. She could even arrange marriages for her children and manage their inheritances. But here's where things get hilarious. If her husband decided to pull an all-nighter at a party or get into some other scandalous Roman nonsense, she had to sit back and just hope that her husband wouldn't completely ruin the family's reputation. So, in this super-controlled domestic empire, the domina was at the mercy of a man who may or may not show up to oversee his empire's finances. Talk about a stressful gig. But here's the real kicker. These dominas were often the real glue that held society together. Let's face it, without them, Roman households would have collapsed under the weight of all that mismanaged wealth and social unrest. Women like these were managing household budgets, supervising the servants, and making sure their families didn't accidentally bankrupt themselves by blowing all their money on sour wine or a questionable investment in a new chariot. But despite doing all of this work, women weren't exactly getting the credit. The Roman man, the emperor, the senator, the general, he got to take all the public accolades. Sure, he might have been in charge of a few wars or the Senate, but in reality, it was his wife who was making sure his dinner was on time and his robes were freshly washed. And as for the kids, they were her responsibility too. Until her husband decided it was time for them to take over the family business. So while the man of the house gets to look like the hero, it's the domina who is actually running the show behind closed doors, and honestly, that's just as frustrating as it sounds. Let's dive deeper into the power dynamic within Roman marriages. Roman men, for all their bravado, were often dependent on their wives for practical reasons, even if they pretended they didn't know it. Roman women, like the domina, wielded a surprising amount of silent power over everything at home. Their husband's success, their children's education, and even the family's political influence often relied on the way the wife managed things. While the man strutted through public spaces, leading armies and delivering speeches, his wife made sure the house actually ran. But that's not public power. That's invisible power, the kind you get when everyone pretends you're just quietly cleaning the floors and organizing the servants. And let's be real here. Men loved to pretend they were in charge while secretly delegating all the real work to their wives. And here's the most ironic part. The domina's power wasn't just about control, it was about survival. Roman women were often tasked with making sure their families didn't get torn apart by political scandal or financial disaster. And that wasn't just about keeping the house clean. It was about ensuring their husband didn't screw up the empire's finances in a drunken stupor. Sure, she was expected to look pretty, but she also had to stay sharp because without her, Roman families wouldn't have had a fighting chance. The domina was essential, necessary, but she was always overshadowed by the public persona of her husband. In a way, she was the ultimate behind-the-scenes operator. Historians still argue over whether these women were empowered in any way, whether control over domestic affairs was enough to grant them true power in Roman society. The truth is, while the domina had power within her home, she was kept out of sight from the critical arenas of politics, military conquest, and public life. She was the silent force that made sure everything stayed afloat, but no one ever bothered to mention her name in the history books. It's like being a CEO without the title, the office, or the respect. Oh, and the paycheck. Still, the Roman household couldn't have functioned without her, and that's the sad, frustrating reality of it. The most powerful women in Rome, they were doing what they had to do, but no one would ever give them credit for it. Let's get straight to the point. If you think the Roman household was a carefree place where women just sat around looking pretty and waiting for their husbands to return from battle, you are deeply mistaken. A Roman housewife wasn't just making dinner. She was the mastermind behind an entire economic unit, managing everything from food supplies to the very survival of the family's legacy. The Roman housewife wasn't some dainty lady who embroidered in her free time. No. She was running an empire on a domestic level without anyone giving her credit for it. I mean, how many men do you think were out there conquering the known world while their wives were making sure they didn't come home to a total disaster? Spoiler, probably all of them. Let's start with the reality of the Roman housewife's life. You think your job is hard? Imagine having to manage an entire household in a society that barely acknowledged your existence. And also, this is the kicker, you were legally considered the property of your husband. That's right. A Roman housewife wasn't just organizing bread deliveries or enslaved people's daily tasks. She was legally bound to her husband's will in a way that would make you never want to complain about your office job again. But she wasn't just taking orders. She was using her invisible influence to ensure that everything worked. Now, let's talk about the domestic economy of ancient Rome for a second. Picture this, you're a Roman wife, you wake up at dawn, and immediately you're in full boss mode. You have to make sure your house is functioning like a well-oiled machine, with everything from cooking to budgeting to child-rearing under your supervision. You don't get a break. Ever. If something breaks, it's on you to fix it. And if something's missing, well, you'd better find a way to replace it, and probably with a certain amount of flair. Think about it. If you ran out of olive oil, you weren't just running to the store. You were managing purchasing, ensuring quality, and somehow squeezing in a little charitable work or social obligation. Oh, and the furnishings. Those grand Roman marble floors and lavish dinner tables? Yeah, your job was to make sure the place looked like $1 million on a shoestring budget. You had to make sure your house looked respectable, because if it didn't, people would start asking questions about whether your husband was fit to rule anything, let alone an empire. Historians still argue over whether the housewife in Roman society was empowered by her position or simply trapped by it. Yes, she had significant control in the home. She ran the household, and that was important. But was she free? Not in the way you would expect. She had authority, but it was tied entirely to her husband's success. If he failed, well, so did she. You were necessary, sure, but you were living on the edge of a financial abyss. One wrong move and your whole household could fall apart. The pressure? Absolutely unbearable. So how did she keep things running smoothly? The housewife wasn't just sitting there knitting socks and complaining about her husband's bad habits. No, she was the operator, overseeing the enslaved people, making sure the food was stored properly, and even managing the budget. And let's be real, a Roman wife knew how to negotiate with the servants. She wasn't about to let them slack off on her watch. She was the queen of the domestic workforce, and unlike today, no one gave her a raise or even a thank you. If she was lucky, her husband might praise her for a good dinner, but that was about it. He was out there making speeches about the greatness of Rome while she was managing everything. And this isn't even the best part. Imagine being the wife of a powerful Roman politician or a wealthy merchant. You weren't just managing the household. You were crafting the reputation of the family. Think about how a family's public image mattered in Rome. You didn't want to be seen as just anyone. You had to show that you were elite. And guess who was responsible for ensuring that the family reputation stayed pristine? You guessed it. The housewife was at the forefront, ensuring that all social obligations were met, all guests were entertained, and the family name was spoken of with respect. And let's not forget the actual political role many of these women had to play. If their husbands were up for an election, guess who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? You, the housewife. You were using your domestic influence to push things in your husband's favor, making sure that he had everything he needed to secure votes, status, and that all-important political career. But once again, you're not getting any credit. It's a bit like being the person who does all the hard work on a group project, but your teammate gets all the glory because they presented it. Women in Roman society had to use their invisible influence in the most tactical ways. They didn't have public power, but they could shape the household and, by extension, the family's position in Roman society. And let's not sugarcoat it. Most of these women were likely doing this without much thanks or recognition. Can you imagine managing your household, keeping your children in line, organizing social events, all while your husband is out there making declarations and being applauded by his peers? It's the ultimate irony. They were the backbone of Roman society, but no one cared. They were necessary, but in a world of military conquest and political power, their contributions often went ignored entirely. Historians still argue about whether these women were actually empowered by their role as housewives or whether they were just trapped in a cycle of invisible labor. Some say they wielded the valid power behind their husbands' public personas, while others argue they were sacrificing their independence for a stable family life. The truth? Probably a little of both. The Roman housewife was necessary, but not in a way that gave her absolute freedom or control. She had influence, sure, but it was limited to the walls of her home, and she was never truly free to create her own identity or career outside the confines of her household duties. So, was she really in charge? Sure, but the real power always seemed to lie just outside her grasp. A woman could run her household like a CEO, but without the title, the recognition, or the credit. Just another invisible cog in a machine that made Rome go. At least she got to be essential, right? Okay, let's take a wild turn here, because we're about to uncover a massive secret that Roman society would rather forget. Women, yes, women, were at the very core of the education system in ancient Rome. But before you start imagining toga-clad scholars on their way to some prestigious Roman university, let me remind you, these women weren't getting credit for their work. They were the unsung educators, the ones teaching the future emperors, senators, and military commanders. And guess who never got a thank you card for it? Yep, these women. They were the true backbone of Roman intellectual life, managing the education of their children, often for free with no recognition whatsoever. Now, let's get into the real deal. The Roman education system wasn't like what we imagine today. There weren't fancy schools and ivy-covered walls. Education was mostly done at home by tutors or, get this, mothers. That's right. While the men were off fighting battles and attending banquets, the women were teaching. They were the ones ensuring that the future of Rome knew how to read, write, and do all those essential things like managing an estate or running a political campaign. No big deal, just shaping the empire one lesson at a time. But, surprise, these women were never praised for their work. They were too busy making sure their little Roman warriors didn't burn the house down while memorizing their Latin vocabulary. But you know who gets all the glory? The men. The ones who received the education, not the ones who delivered it. Here's the twist. These women weren't just teaching basic stuff. They were responsible for giving their children the cultural capital needed to thrive in Roman society. They taught everything from history and philosophy to writing and basic math. And if you were the mother of a future senator or military leader, guess who had to make sure that child understood the finer points of political maneuvering? You, the Roman mother, had to teach your son everything he needed to make it big in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. But what did you get out of it? Probably nothing except for a worn-out toga and a bunch of unappreciative kids. Historians still argue about whether Roman women had a formalized role in education, or if their influence was more like unofficial tutoring behind closed doors. Some say women were only involved in the early years of education, teaching children the basics, and then handing them off to male educators once the serious studies began. Others argue that women had a much deeper involvement and were responsible for the intellectual development of the youth, shaping the minds of future rulers and philosophers without ever getting a thank you card. Personally, I think we can agree that Roman mothers, at the very least, were always there, ensuring their children grew up with the tools they needed to succeed. And yet, those same mothers never made it into the historical record, except maybe as a footnote. There were no statues dedicated to them, no Mother of Rome awards. Nope, they were just the silent, invisible hands that shaped the empire's future. Let's talk about what that looked like in real life. You're a Roman woman with a son who's been chosen for a great future. It's your job to make sure he knows his Latin, his Roman law, his philosophy, and how to perform at dinner parties. Because, in Rome, social events were as important as military victories. But hold on, this wasn't a cozy teaching environment with soft chairs and notebooks. No. This was a world where your son's education could determine whether your family would ever rise in Roman society. It was a high-stakes game, and you were the one holding the cards. If you failed in your teaching, your child could end up being a poor soldier or, worse, a failure in the Senate. No pressure, right? And let's not forget the other women who had a hand in shaping Roman education. Those who were employed as tutors or nannies in wealthy families. They were often educated women themselves, sometimes even more qualified than the male tutors their employers hired. These women would have been responsible for directly shaping the intellectual trajectory of wealthy Roman children. Think about it. These women were passing on the intellectual tools that would help those kids grow into some of the most powerful individuals in Roman society. But here's the kicker. While the children got all the accolades, those women were just hired hands. Never truly seen or recognized for their work. They could have been the intellectual mentors of future emperors, but they got no glory, no rewards, and most definitely no statues. Historians still argue whether these nanny tutors were ever truly recognized for their role in Roman intellectual life. Were they just hired help? Or were they quietly shaping the empire? Some scholars suggest that women who worked in these roles might have had more freedom in their intellectual pursuits, while others argue that they were merely subordinate to the male educators and men of the house who got all the credit. One thing is clear, though, these women, however unacknowledged, played a massive part in shaping Roman intellectual culture, and yet they vanished into obscurity, just like most women of their time. And then there's the educational system for women themselves. Unlike their male counterparts, Roman women didn't get formal schooling in the traditional sense. They weren't enrolling in schools to become senators, generals, or philosophers. But here's the crazy part. Many Roman women were still highly educated by their own families. Think about it. Women weren't expected to attend public schools or universities because those didn't really exist in the way we think of them. Instead, their education took place in the home, where they were trained by their mothers, tutors, or occasionally by male philosophers who visited their homes. While they weren't given the chance to be public intellectuals, they certainly could read, write, and think critically. But again, society was more interested in what they could do for their husbands than what they could contribute intellectually to the broader Roman world. So here's the big question. Were these women actually empowered by their role in education? Or were they perpetuating a system that only benefited men? Did they have real intellectual power? Or were they just tools in a system that made sure they stayed in their proper place in Roman society? Historians have debated this for centuries, and I don't think anyone will ever conclude. But one thing is for sure. These women were the silent architects of Rome's future. They may not have been credited for it, but they were shaping the minds of future generations, ensuring that Rome didn't fall into intellectual decay. And that, my friends, is something worth acknowledging. Alright, let's talk about the real workforce of ancient Rome, the ones who made everything happen behind the scenes. No, I'm not talking about the senators or the noblemen strutting around in their designer togas. I'm talking about the enslaved people. And here's where things get really interesting. Roman slaves weren't just working the fields or cleaning houses. They were also some of the hardest working, most necessary women in Roman society. They were running the household, keeping the economy moving, and doing everything no one wanted to talk about. You think the Roman Empire could have thrived without them? Spoiler, absolutely not. Now, let's get down to brass tacks. Slavery in ancient Rome was massive. It wasn't some niche side hustle, it was the backbone of Roman society. Everything from agriculture to domestic services relied on enslaved people. And guess who was making sure the house stayed in order while the men went off to war or politics? That's right, the enslaved women. They were cooking, cleaning, looking after the children, managing the household goods, and basically keeping the Roman Empire from falling into chaos. And yet, the only thing anyone ever cared about was their status as property. Talk about a raw deal. But here's the twist. While they were considered property, these women also controlled a lot more than their masters realized. They ran the households they lived in, especially in wealthy Roman families. Think about it. Enslaved women often had to supervise other enslaved people, manage daily tasks, and take on administrative duties within the home. They were literally the managers, the behind-the-scenes operators, ensuring the house ran smoothly. If something went wrong, they had to be the ones to fix it. If the kids didn't do their homework or if the food wasn't prepared on time, it was their fault. And yet, they got no credit for it. No one was ever handing out medals for Best Slave of the Year. They were just expected to keep it all together, like the silent pillars that held everything upright. Historians still argue about how much agency enslaved people in Rome truly had. Were they just victims of the system, or were they, in some ways, secretly in control of their own lives and fates? Some scholars argue that enslaved women could use their position to influence power dynamics within the household subtly. If they were trusted enough to manage other enslaved people or oversee the home's operations, they could technically leverage that influence. But let's be clear, it wasn't enough to grant them freedom. They were still considered property, and no matter how hard they worked or how much influence they wielded, they would never have the rights or recognition they deserved. Let's dive deeper. In wealthy households, there were often multiple enslaved women who played different roles within the domestic system. Some were tasked with cooking and cleaning, others with caring for the children, while some were even trained as teachers to educate the children of the household. This last role might have been the most interesting because it showed just how much power enslaved women actually had. They weren't just serving in the traditional sense. They were literally shaping the future of the family, teaching the children how to read, write, and be good little Romans. But again, it wasn't about their intellectual contributions. It was about making sure the next generation was prepared to carry on the family's wealth and legacy. Enslaved women also played a huge role in the agriculture industry. While men were off to war, enslaved women were in the fields, working the land, tending to crops, and making sure the food kept coming in. Without them, there would have been no food to feed the empire. Yet, you rarely hear about their contributions in any Roman history books. They were invisible, just like the women who worked as midwives, tutors, or homemakers, always doing the work but never getting the credit. And let's not sugarcoat it. Working the land as an enslaved person wasn't glamorous. It was grueling work. Women were out there, exposed to the elements, doing the labor that made the empire run. Yet their lives were lived in the shadows, where they were never acknowledged, respected, or rewarded. In contrast to the visible glory of Roman soldiers or generals, the lives of these enslaved women were a grind. They weren't given grand speeches, statues, or even the bare minimum of recognition. But think about it. Without them, the empire wouldn't have survived. They kept things running smoothly, often working multiple jobs in one day to keep their masters happy and the house in order. Whether they were cleaning, cooking, or making sure the master's business was going well, enslaved women were in control of the domestic machine that made Roman life possible. But in terms of actual power, it was all a mirage. They had no legal rights, no freedom, and no hope of ever escaping their status. And here's the kicker. While they were essential to the daily functions of Roman society, they were completely disregarded by most historians. It's almost as if they never existed. Their lives boiled down to a single sentence. There were slaves in Rome, but these women weren't just there. They were doing the work that made Roman society function. They were as essential to the empire as any senator or soldier, and yet their voices were silenced in history. Their contributions were ignored, and their lives were forgotten by all but those who benefited from their labor. Historians still argue about the role of enslaved people in Roman society, especially the women, wondering if they ever could resist or gain freedom. Some say that enslaved people had no agency whatsoever, trapped in a system that offered them no way out. Others believe that, through cunning and small acts of defiance, enslaved women could gain some semblance of control over their lives. But one thing is clear: these women were necessary. And no matter how invisible they were, no matter how much they were overlooked, they were crucial to Rome's rise, survival, and eventual fall. Without them, the empire would have crumbled into chaos. The truth about enslaved women in ancient Rome is this: they were everywhere, doing everything, and no one cared. They were necessary in the way that any unacknowledged labor is necessary, crucial to the functioning of the system but without any recognition or reward. They were the workers who kept everything running, but history never bothered to mention them. As a result, their stories were erased, and their power was never fully acknowledged. But, if you think about it, they were probably more powerful than anyone ever gave them credit for. After all, without them, Rome's empire wouldn't have even made it off the ground. Talk about being the unsung heroes of the empire. Alright, let's talk about something extra special in Roman society. Something that would make even modern Instagram influencers squirm. The strange intersection of beauty and power in ancient Rome. You see, in Rome, if you wanted to climb the social ladder, you didn't just need a good family name, a fat bank account, or an army of enslaved people. You needed to look the part. That's right. Being a Roman woman wasn't just about being helpful, it was about being visually desirable, and that came with its own set of problems. Because let's be real, in a society obsessed with appearance and public perception, you weren't just required to run your household. You had to run around looking like a goddess on a budget, using everything from lead-based makeup to ancient beauty potions that were probably more toxic than your last breakup. So, let's break down what it took to maintain Roman beauty and how it was all tangled up in power and societal expectations. Imagine this: you're a Roman woman, and it's not enough to exist, you need to look like you're part of an elite class. But how do you do that when you don't have the luxury of modern cosmetics or, any idea what actual health is? Well, Romans had you covered with their special blend of bizarre beauty standards, where looking flawless often meant you were slowly poisoning yourself. And no one cared, because looking beautiful meant you were important. Simple as that. Here's the thing: Roman women were expected to use cosmetics, a lot of cosmetics. But these weren't the cute, cruelty-free products we're used to today. No, these were concoctions of toxic substances like lead, mercury, and sulfur. And they applied them to their faces in an attempt to make their skin look pale, smooth, and flawless. If you were a Roman woman, you needed to have that luminous glow that told the world, "I'm wealthy, I'm important, and I have nothing better to do than put this stuff on my face." Lead-based makeup was all the rage, and while it gave the illusion of beauty, it also did severe damage to the skin and health of the wearer. But, beauty is pain, right? Historians still argue whether Roman women knew the risks of their beauty routines or whether they were completely unaware that their makeup was literally poisoning them. Some believe that women in Rome used these toxic substances without a second thought, while others argue that they were well aware and didn't care because looking the part was so crucial to surviving in Roman society. And let's face it, if looking like a goddess meant using a little bit of mercury, it was worth the risk to your health. After all, you wouldn't get invited to the right parties if you didn't have that flawless, glowing skin. Because, as we know, in Rome, it wasn't about what you did, it was about how you looked doing it. But it wasn't just about face paint and toxic powders. Roman women were also expected to maintain their hair in a particular way. Picture this: you're a Roman woman with big dreams, and by big dreams, I mean big hair. Romans were all about those luscious, voluminous curls, the kind of hair that screamed, "I'm important enough to have slaves help me with this." The process was painfully elaborate, with women using special oils and tools to curl, braid, and set their hair. And if you were feeling extra fashionable, you'd add in hairpieces. Because nothing says powerful Roman woman like a good old wig. Let's also not forget about the Roman concept of perfume, which was an essential part of a Roman woman's aesthetic. I'm talking about perfumes made from everything but roses. Romans loved to experiment with their scents, often mixing strange, exotic ingredients like myrrh, saffron, and even garlic to create their personal fragrance. Now, imagine walking into a Roman banquet, and you're surrounded by a whiff of something that might have smelled great, but also smelled like a garden of garlic and spices. No, I'm not joking. Garlic was a staple in Roman perfume, probably because it was cheap and, honestly, who wouldn't want to smell like they just walked out of an Italian kitchen? So, where does all this crazy beauty nonsense fit into the larger narrative of power in ancient Rome? Oh, it fits in real nice because in Rome, how you looked determined your status. Women didn't just exist in the background. They were presented to the world as flawless beings, whether or not they were actually functional members of society. Beauty, in Roman times, was a tool often used to secure political, social, and economic advantages. If you were beautiful, you were powerful, at least on the outside. It was about creating a public persona, a mask, if you will, that would allow you to navigate Roman society, collecting favors, influence, and wealth. Roman women used their appearance as currency, and it was a game of appearances where the more you invested in looking perfect, the more you could secure for yourself. Historians still argue whether this obsession with beauty and appearance was a source of power for Roman women or whether it was simply a reflection of the patriarchal values that existed in society. Was it a tool that allowed women to leverage their beauty for influence, or was it a way of keeping them in line, making sure that their worth was always tied to their looks? Some argue that beauty gave women a certain amount of social influence. In contrast, others claim that the obsession with appearance just restricted their ability ever to be taken seriously in any other capacity. Because if a woman in Rome was busy getting her hair and face done for hours, she wasn't exactly leading political campaigns or military operations. In any case, beauty in Rome wasn't just about vanity, it was a strategic play. It was an attempt to gain the upper hand in a society where women had limited rights and even fewer opportunities for power. Being beautiful was the closest thing to power that many Roman women would ever experience. They could wield their attractiveness like a weapon in the social game, securing alliances, attention, and, if they were lucky, wealth. But at the same time, they were trapped by their own beauty, unable to escape the narrow confines of what Roman society valued in them. If you were a beautiful Roman woman, you were essential, but only as a symbol, never as a person with real, lasting power. You thought the gladiatorial arena was just for men, right? Well, surprise. Women weren't just sitting on the sidelines eating grapes while watching burly men fight to the death. No, some women were getting in on the action themselves, fighting in the arena like total bosses, and frankly, they probably would have made the whole thing way more interesting. The idea of women in the arena tends to be glossed over in history, because, let's face it, we all know the gladiator narrative is too masculine to include women as serious contenders. But don't let the silence of history fool you. Women did, in fact, participate in gladiatorial combat. And not just as spectators, mind you, but as actual fighters. They were called the gladiatresses. And while they didn't get the same celebrity status as their male counterparts, they were there, in the blood-soaked sand, throwing down like it was nobody's business. So, let's break this down. Imagine you're living in ancient Rome, an empire built on warrior culture, where everything revolves around military prowess and bloody spectacles. The gladiatorial games are the equivalent of your modern-day UFC fights, except with a lot more swords, shields, and blood. Now you've got the standard gladiators. Big, muscular guys with names like Maximus. Probably not, but you get the vibe. And while these men are out there fighting for glory and entertainment, there are also some women who, for reasons we'll get into, decided to step up and show the world what they were made of. These women weren't just hanging out in the audience. They were getting in the arena, strapping on armor, and fighting for their lives. Imagine that, fighting for entertainment in a society that valued their lives less than those of the men watching them. Now, historians still argue about how standard female gladiators actually were. Some believe they were rare, appearing only for special exhibitions to shock and excite the crowds. Others suggest that women fighters had a more permanent presence, particularly in the backwoods arenas where the rules were a bit more flexible. Regardless of their frequency, what's undeniable is that women were there standing in the same blood-stained sand as the men, ready to fight, survive, and prove themselves worthy of being called a gladiator. But here's the thing. While these women were getting it done in the arena, they were still bound by the same societal rules that kept them out of most other aspects of Roman life. They were warriors, but they were still women, and in Rome that meant they were limited to the margins of history. The gladiatorial games, which glorified men's courage and strength, had a flimsy little footnote for the women who dared to fight in them. If the men were the stars, the women were the underappreciated side acts, and not much has changed since. So why did women fight in the gladiatorial games in the first place? It wasn't for the glory, that's for sure. For most of these women, the choice to become a gladiatrix wasn't precisely an empowering, free choice situation. Many were slaves or prisoners of war, forced into combat because they had no other way to survive. Others were probably social outcasts who decided they'd rather fight for their lives than waste away in obscurity. But despite the grim circumstances, the gladiatrices became symbols of something much bigger: resilience and defiance. They didn't have the luxury of choosing a respectable career. They were fighting not just for their survival, but to carve out a space in a world that constantly told them they didn't matter. But here's where it gets really messed up. While these women were literally fighting to the death, their male counterparts were being treated like celebrities, paraded through the streets, rewarded with prizes, and getting all the glory. Women gladiators? They might have gotten a pat on the back, but there was no glory in it for them. They didn't get statues built in their honor, no one wrote epics about their victories, and no one gave them a grand funeral when they died in battle. No, they were just another casualty of a violent, patriarchal society that used them for entertainment and then forgot about them once the show was over. Historians still argue about whether these women gladiators were ever truly respected in the Roman world. Were they seen as brave warriors, like their male counterparts? Or were they merely seen as freak show acts that were paraded around to satisfy the crowd's hunger for blood? Some scholars suggest that women gladiators were a novelty act, a rare and shocking sight meant to attract crowds and generate excitement. Others argue that women in the arena were taken seriously, albeit in their own tragic, limited way. But what is certain is that, whether they were celebrated or despised, these women had to fight for everything they had. They fought for their lives, for their dignity, and for a chance to be seen as something more than just a side note in the Roman saga. Think about the irony of it all. Roman society, which treated women like property in so many aspects of life, had a small but significant group of women who were literally fighting for their lives in front of crowds, commanding the attention of thousands. And yet, when the dust settled and the sand was washed clean, those same women were erased from history. Their contributions, forgotten. Their names, lost to time. In a society where men were immortalized in statues and stories, the women who fought in the arena were left to fade into the background. And here's the worst part. These gladiatrices were necessary, in the sense that their fights brought excitement, ensured the continuity of entertainment, and filled the coffers of wealthy patrons. They were part of the cultural engine that sustained Roman society. Yet, as with so many other women in history, their contributions were always overlooked in favor of the men who were writing the narrative. Historians still debate whether these female gladiators were truly empowered by their participation in the games. Were they able to use their position for any political or social leverage? Did their presence in the arena challenge Roman gender norms? Or were they just another example of women being forced to take on men's roles, with no recognition of their efforts? One thing is sure. These women were fighting, surviving, and doing things that most men would never have dared to do. But in the end, their victories and struggles were swept aside by the very empire that had used them for sport. So what's the final takeaway? Women gladiators were the ultimate symbol of Roman women's existence. They were necessary, but invisible. They fought for their survival, but they didn't get to write their own story. The men got the glory, the fame, and the legacy. The women, well, they got to die for the crowd's amusement and then be forgotten. Let's be real. When we think about politics in ancient Rome, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, it's probably men, sitting in fancy toga-clad circles, making decisions that changed the course of history. Men like Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Cicero come to mind. But here's the kicker. Women weren't exactly excluded from the Roman political scene. In fact, they were often the puppeteers behind the curtain, pulling strings and influencing decisions in ways that history would prefer to ignore. Now, I'm not talking about women running for public office or commanding legions, although I wouldn't put it past some of them. I'm talking about influence, the kind that didn't need a podium, a Senate seat, or a military uniform. No, these women were pulling the strings in the most sneaky, under-the-radar, behind-the-scenes ways possible. You know, like when you want something done at home and you ask your mom, only for your dad to act like it was his idea. That kind of political maneuvering. Let's start with the mothers of Rome's greatest leaders. Take Agrippina the Younger, for example. You might recognize her as the mother of Emperor Nero. Yeah, that Nero, the guy who later became infamous for playing the lyre while Rome burned. But Agrippina wasn't just sitting around, letting her son get famous. She was working behind the scenes, positioning her son to take power. She maneuvered through the political ranks, weaving webs of influence and ensuring that Nero would eventually become emperor. Was she in charge? Oh, absolutely not. She was just a woman, after all. But was she behind the scenes making all the big moves? Hell yes. Agrippina had more power and influence than half the men in Rome combined, and she wasn't even on the throne. But did anyone publicly acknowledge her political prowess? Of course not. History remembers her as the overbearing mother, not the savvy political strategist. Classic. Historians still argue over whether women like Agrippina were truly in control or merely themselves at the behest of the male power structure. Some say, for example, that Agrippina was merely a tool in a game played by men. In contrast, others argue that she actively manipulated men in positions of power to further her own ambitions. Either way, the fact that a woman like Agrippina could wield so much influence in a man's world speaks volumes about how much power women had, just not in the ways history tends to acknowledge. But let's not forget about Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus, and another behind-the-scenes political powerhouse. You might think of her as just another Roman empress, but Livia wasn't sitting quietly in the background. No, she was making sure her son, Tiberius, would take the throne, even if it meant eliminating a few obstacles along the way. Livia's political savvy was legendary, and while she might not have been ruling in a traditional sense, she was certainly ruling from the shadows. She used her position as wife and mother to maneuver through Rome's political landscape, ensuring that her son succeeded Augustus and that her family remained in control. Was she in the Senate making speeches? No, but was she shaping the future of Rome? Absolutely. And guess what? Historians still argue about how much she really influenced Augustus's decisions. Some say she was the mastermind behind his policies. Others claim she was just a figment of his ambitions. But whatever the truth is, one thing is clear. Livia was pulling the strings from her position as empress. Women like Agrippina and Livia weren't exceptions. They were the rule, powerful women who weren't given the title or public recognition they deserved. They worked behind the scenes, ensuring their families stayed in power and influencing politics in ways that would make even the most seasoned Roman senators look like amateurs. Women shaped Rome's political landscape, even if they weren't allowed to sit at the big table. And what about Julia Domna, the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus? She wasn't just sitting at home while her husband ran the empire. No, she was deeply involved in the political and military affairs of Rome. She even guided and advised her sons, Carus and Geta, after her husband's death, all while navigating the cutthroat world of Roman politics. Like the other women in this section, Julia wasn't publicly acknowledged for her political prowess. She wasn't out there giving speeches in the Senate or commanding legions, but she was a key player in ensuring the stability of the Severan dynasty. She may not have been a queen in the traditional sense, but she wore the crown behind the scenes. Historians still debate how much of Roman history can be attributed to these women. Some believe their influence was underestimated, while others think their power was directly linked to the men in their lives. The truth? It's somewhere in between. These women were clearly necessary to Rome's political stability, but they weren't receiving the public recognition or credit they deserved. They were the quiet powerhouses, shaping the future of the empire while the men got all the glory. And let's not forget the role of women in religious politics. Women played a huge part in the political rituals of Rome. Take the Vestal Virgins, for example. These women were deeply involved in maintaining the sacred flame believed to ensure the prosperity of the Roman state. You think that was just some glorified babysitting gig? Think again. The Vestals were revered, and their actions had political consequences. A single misstep could be seen as a bad omen for Rome, and their public status gave them a specific influence over Roman politics. The high priestesses and their influence over the religious rites meant they could influence public sentiment and political decisions, whether they meant to or not. Women in religion weren't just passive participants. They were power brokers in a political system where religion and politics were inseparable. So what's the big takeaway here? Women in ancient Rome weren't just quiet observers of politics. They were the ones behind the scenes, pulling strings, making moves, and quietly asserting power in ways that went unnoticed by historians for centuries. They weren't running for Senate seats or leading armies, but they were shaping Rome's future with every political maneuver, every marriage, and every word of advice they whispered into the ears of the men in charge. These women were necessary to the political process. They were the invisible rulers of the Roman Empire, ensuring the empire didn't collapse, even if their names were never recorded in history. The political power of these women may have been subtle, but it was no less real. They didn't need public recognition because they had private power, which was all they needed to maintain control. All right, let's take a massive leap forward to today, because the story of the Roman necessary woman has a darkly ironic twist. When you look at her against modern gender roles, there's this bizarre, discomforting déjà vu. It's like peeking into the future and realizing that, despite thousands of years of progress, women are still expected to be the unsung heroes, holding everything together behind the scenes, doing the hard work while men get the credit. It's like when you try to open a jar that feels like it's been sealed by a 2-ton weight, only to have someone swoop in, pop it open, and act like they invented the wheel. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, that's how Roman women would have felt if they were alive today. Asterisk still stuck in the background asterisk, despite doing the real heavy lifting. Let's take a good look at the Roman necessary woman, the midwife, the enslaved person, the tutor, the housewife, the gladiatrix. Those gritty, indispensable women who made sure everything ran smoothly, even as their names were erased from history. Fast forward to today. You'd think by now women would have caught a break, that they'd be in charge, getting the recognition and respect they deserve for carrying societies on their backs. But if you take a closer look, you'll see that modern women are often still stuck in a perpetual cycle of "we need you," but we won't actually acknowledge how important you are. Let's start with the modern housewife. Sure, today women can choose to work or not work, but let's not pretend the mental labor of running a household isn't still wildly unequal. You may not have to be a Roman domina managing enslaved people and maintaining your status through dinner parties, but if you're running the household, guess what? You're still the one worrying about what's for dinner, whether the kids have clean clothes, and making sure that everything, asterisk and everyone asterisk, stays in line. The work is invisible, underappreciated, and very much like the role of Roman women. You do it and you're essential, but don't expect any parade in your honor, sweetheart. You're just expected to do it all while the world marches on without noticing. And don't even get me started on the unpaid labor women still perform today. In many parts of the world, women are still expected to manage the bulk of child-rearing, cooking, cleaning, and caregiving, while their male counterparts get to strut around the office or out in the world acting like their job is the only one that matters. The same was true in Roman society. Men might have made the decisions, but the real work was being done by women. And today, the gender pay gap, the mental load of domestic work, and the social expectations on women to be perfect mothers, partners, and professionals, well, you get the picture. It's basically a Roman rerun. Same invisible labor, same erased contributions, just with a slightly more progressive wardrobe. Now let's look at modern-day women in politics, and this one's a real kicker. You know how women in ancient Rome had to navigate political power without ever stepping into the public eye? Well, surprise, today's women still have to do a lot of the same. Sure, they can run for office, and thankfully many do. But the game is still rigged, and the political arena still screams male-dominated. Women are expected to be behind the scenes, pulling strings, shaping policy, and managing social movements, yet the men are the ones who get the official recognition. Take any modern-day election cycle, how many women do you hear about behind the scenes, advising, strategizing, and managing campaigns? Yet, it's the men who are on TV, the men who get the headlines. Women might spearhead campaigns, but the world still celebrates their male counterparts as the true leaders. The ironic twist here? Women in ancient Rome had to use their invisibility as a form of power, whereas today's women still use that same invisibility to push the boundaries. Think about it. Women in the Roman world were so essential to the empire's survival, but they could never publicly take credit for their work. Fast forward to today, and women still often have to navigate the same constraints. We've moved past the toga-clad days, but do we really? Yes, women have power now, but they often have to prove it in ways their male counterparts never do. The modern woman still finds herself in a weird limbo, where she's supposed to have equal footing. Still, she is expected to take on a disproportionate amount of domestic labor, political maneuvering, and cultural influence, all. At the same time, society continues to forget her efforts. Now, let's look at professional women, because the corporate world isn't exactly the utopia we like to think it is. Today, women might be CEOs, doctors, or top lawyers, but the constant battle persists. They're still being scrutinized for their looks more than their accomplishments, while their male colleagues get away with far more. In ancient Rome, a woman's beauty determined her social value. While today we like to think we're more evolved, modern women still face the same ridiculous pressures to maintain a perfect public image, regardless of what they're actually doing. In the boardroom, women have to play the game smarter than men, because society isn't willing to acknowledge their full potential. The question is, have we really come that far from the Roman era? Sure, women are now allowed to vote, work, and participate in politics, but is the world really different? Women are still expected to balance a million other roles without acknowledgement. Just as women in ancient Rome were seen as necessary, but never truly valued for their contributions. It's like the ancient domina, always in control of the home, but never in charge of the empire. Today's women are still juggling the invisible tasks that make everything work while the world gives all the recognition to the public players. So, here's the darkly hilarious truth. In many ways, we're still living in the world of the necessary woman, just with better cosmetics, Wi-Fi, and a whole lot more expectations. Historians still argue whether the necessary women in ancient Rome were victims of patriarchy or co-conspirators in their own oppression. And guess what? You can make the same case about modern women. Some argue that we've broken free from the shackles of Roman gender roles, while others suggest that the modern world has just polished the same outdated structures to make them look more inclusive. The fight continues, whether it's in the boardroom, the Senate, or the kitchen. One thing is for sure, women are still necessary, and they're still underappreciated. But this time, they've got more tools to fight back. And maybe, just maybe, this time they'll finally get the recognition they deserve. All right, grab your proverbial sword and shield, because we're heading into the battlefield of feminist archaeology and historical revisionism. We've spent centuries ignoring the real stories of women in ancient Rome. The midwives, the homemakers, the gladiatresses, and now, finally, the tides are turning. You see, the feminist reclamation of ancient women's power is about damn time, like seriously. For far too long, we've let history tell us that women in ancient societies like Rome were mere footnotes in the stories of emperors and gladiators. But now, modern scholars, activists, and historians are saying, hey, what about them? What about the women who did all the real work behind the scenes? What about the women who fought, who survived, and who, despite the erasure, built the foundations of Rome while being completely ignored by the annals of history? Here's where the plot thickens. In the past few decades, there's been a massive shift in how we understand Roman women. While it used to be that historians would throw women into the miscellaneous pile, right next to the irrelevant fashion tips of Roman senators, modern scholars are digging deeper and asking real questions. Where were these women's voices? Where were their stories? How did they hold power without being acknowledged for it? The feminist reclamation of these women's history is nothing short of a movement, where we're finally looking past the macho narratives of warriors and emperors and starting to listen to the women who were quietly, asterisk and not so quietly asterisk, shaping everything. Let's talk about the mothers, wives, enslaved people, and gladiatresses, the ones who kept the Roman machine oiled and running, while the men took the credit. These women were often the real architects of the empire's success. Think about it. Without the women who managed the estates, raised the next generation of warriors and politicians, and ran the household finances, Rome would have been a disaster. Yet, history has relegated them to the margins. But now, feminist historians and activists are reclaiming these women's narratives, highlighting how they fought for survival, maneuvered through oppressive systems, and made silent contributions that were often the real reason the empire didn't crumble under its own weight. But it's not just about finding their voices and writing them into the history books. This movement is about rethinking power. In ancient Rome, power wasn't just about holding a political office or leading an army. Power could be quiet, subtle, invisible, and yet still incredibly effective. And guess what? That's the power women had. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was profoundly influential. Modern feminists aren't just demanding that women be recognized as warriors or senators. They're demanding that we acknowledge the other kinds of power women held, the type that kept Rome together long after the senators and generals went home for dinner. The feminist reclamation of these women's stories is a reckoning. We're finally addressing the question, why have we erased them from history? Why is it that the women who were necessary to the empire's survival are barely mentioned? Some scholars argue that it's because women's power was so inherently private that it didn't fit into the masculine version of history that's been written. Men had visible power, fighting in wars, making speeches, building monuments. Women had invisible power, ensuring households survived, managing finances, keeping the children fed and educated. But the invisibility of this power meant it was ignored, written out, or belittled as just domestic work. Now, though, feminist historians are pushing for a new understanding of what power actually was in ancient societies. And guess what? It was often found in the most domestic, private spheres of life, things that weren't traditionally deemed worthy of historical record but were essential to the functioning of Roman society. Historians still argue whether the invisibility of these women was a form of resilience or whether it was simply a tragic consequence of patriarchy's grip on society. Some argue that women were able to flourish in their own, often hidden, spaces, finding power in family structures and through unofficial networks. Others suggest that the erasure of women's contributions was an active decision made by historians who preferred stories about male heroes rather than the everyday, necessary women who kept everything functioning. The truth is, both narratives are valid. These women did create a sort of resilience in their roles, but the fact remains that they were ignored, their voices silenced in favor of the men who led the public charge. Now, let's take a moment and talk about the long-awaited feminist resurgence, the modern movement to rewrite history and give these women the credit they deserved from the beginning. Women are now reclaiming their space in Roman history, uncovering their stories through archaeology, literature, and philosophy. The feminist approach is to recognize that, even without the title or public recognition, women were the true power brokers of Rome. They weren't just the wives or the mothers, they were the strategists, the managers, the architects of Rome's cultural and political identity. Think about how much we've romanticized the male gladiator, the male emperor, the male soldier. Now, think about how the contributions of the real women who held the empire together have been systematically erased. Feminist historians are now saying, no more. Women like Agrippina, Livia, and the gladiatresses are no longer mere footnotes, they're reclaiming their place in history. Here's the dark irony. Just as the feminists of today are pushing for the recognition of ancient women's contributions, modern women are still fighting for the same recognition. In many ways, the struggle continues. Women are still fighting to have their roles recognized as essential to the functioning of society, whether in the workplace, the home, or the political sphere. Women still make up the majority of caregivers, educators, and unpaid laborers, yet their contributions are often undervalued. The parallels are impossible to ignore. The feminist reclamation of ancient Roman women's stories is as much about understanding what they went through as it is about recognizing the ways women are still overlooked today. History is repeating itself, and we're finally starting to acknowledge the importance of those necessary women who, against all odds, kept it all together. So what's the endgame here? The feminist reclamation of ancient women's roles is just the beginning. It's about giving them their due credit, *finally star. But it's also about understanding the ways women's power has been historically diminished and erasing the myths that power can only be visible to be real. In ancient Rome, women were necessary, and that's the truth that needs to be told. So, you've made it this far. Thank you for sticking with me through this wild ride. We've seen how the necessary woman of ancient Rome was the unrecognized glue holding everything together, silent, essential, and invisible to history. But now we're going to zoom out and ask the big question. What's the legacy of these women and where the heck are they now? Because let's be real, if you've been keeping score, these women didn't just make the Roman Empire work, they made every empire work. And yet, the struggle for their recognition continues. It's like watching someone nail down a leaking pipe with one hand while the other hand gets completely ignored. The work's still happening, but the credit? Not so much. The truth is, the legacy of the necessary woman in Rome isn't just relegated to the dustbin of history. No. She's everywhere. Modern women are the descendants of these unsung heroines, the ones who keep the gears of society turning while everyone else gets the accolades. And just as their Roman ancestors did, they are still fighting for recognition. But now they've got microphones, social media platforms, and a global stage where they can finally demand credit for their work. Don't get it twisted, the battle is far from over. Still, the stage is set for a new era of acknowledgement, and the necessary woman of ancient Rome has, in some ways, evolved into the modern-day activist, professional, and social advocate who refuses to be erased. Let's talk about the today's necessary woman for a second. We've got modern-day gladiatresses, but they're not fighting with swords in the Colosseum. Instead, they're battling through wage gaps, gender biases, and the emotional labor that society constantly expects them to bear. These are the women who build careers, raise children, keep their households afloat, and keep the world turning. *all at one star. They fight invisible battles that don't end with cheers from the crowd or statues erected in their honor. It's the fight that never stops. Much like their Roman counterparts, today's women are still essential to the survival of society, even if they don't always get the credit they deserve. Think about it, who was on the front lines of the pandemic as healthcare workers, teachers, and essential staff? Yep, women. And yet, the men in the same roles still get the spotlight and the recognition, while the women do the same work with less applause, fewer accolades, and definitely fewer pay raises. We've also got modern women in politics, where the same dynamics play out in a slightly different form. Just like Agrippina, Livia, and the other Roman political players who never got their due, today's women are still working behind the scenes. You don't think they're shaping political platforms, organizing grassroots movements, and holding their governments accountable? Think again. Women are essential to the political landscape in ways that are often ignored until something goes wrong. But the truth is, every time you see a major political shift, a women's march, or a social movement, you can bet a woman is leading it. Maybe not on a podium with a microphone, but absolutely in the trenches, organizing, strategizing, and pushing for change. And again, while men are celebrated for their leadership roles, these women are often left behind, their names not recorded in the history books, their efforts forgotten the moment the media shifts its focus. Then there's the corporate world. Women are running companies, making considerable strides in STEM fields, and shaping the future of industries from tech to media. But how often do you hear about the women who are pulling the levers of change, making the deals, and innovating for the next generation? Not as often as you should. Yes, women are in positions of power, but it's still usually behind the scenes. They're the silent CEOs, the invisible strategists who are doing the hard work while the men take the credit. Women like the ones in ancient Rome, who were the real backbone of society, are still doing the same work today. But are they getting the recognition they deserve? Nope. They're still the necessary women, holding everything up without any fanfare. Now, let's talk about the women who are literally carrying entire industries right now. Think of the care workers, the teachers, the nurses, and yes, the moms who are managing households while working full-time. They're just like the Roman homemakers who, despite being the most crucial cog in the machine, never got any credit for it. Today, women still carry the mental load of domestic labor, without any thanks, and certainly without any real recognition from society. You can look at Roman women in households and see the same thing happening today. Women doing everything, organizing, managing, leading, and getting nothing but exhaustion in return. Just like their ancient counterparts, they are the invisible forces that ensure the survival of families, businesses, and societies. Yet their names are barely whispered, if at all. But here's the kicker. Today's women are fighting for that recognition. And they're doing it in every area of life. Whether it's running for office, pushing back against systemic inequalities, or starting businesses, women are fighting for space at the table. They're no longer content to be invisible. They're taking up space, making their voices heard, and shaking the foundations of the systems that have tried to keep them in the shadows for centuries. The battle for the necessary woman's rightful place in history is finally happening, and it's happening loudly. Feminist movements are reshaping the narrative, not just by celebrating women's accomplishments, but by reclaiming the forgotten voices from the past. In a way, we're in a global reckoning of sorts, a long overdue movement to recognize the contributions of women, particularly those who've been erased from historical narratives. We're finally acknowledging that women like Agrippina and Livia, and even enslaved people and gladiatresses, weren't just passive bystanders. They were actively shaping Rome's future, just as today's women are shaping the world's future. From political activism to corporate powerhouses, from household management to the front lines of healthcare, women are still doing the work. The only difference now is that we're starting to hear them. And the best part? It's only going to get better. The fight for women's recognition, power, and rights isn't a battle that will be won tomorrow, but it's a fight that will keep pushing forward, until one day, women will be finally recognized for their proper role in history. No longer will the necessary woman be invisible. No longer will she be the hidden force behind the throne. The essential woman will stand front and center, her name written into the history books for all to see.